Hello and welcome. Yeah, I want to do a quick chat about the most recent book I finished, but before I get to that, I want to explain I'm going to do something a little different at the end of this chat than I've done before. You may have seen from my other videos that I'm reading off of a must-read, sort of a reading list, a must-read 27 TBR must-read list. And the last few books that I've chosen, I've actually let the universe decide by doing a random drawing because I'm down to like my last 12 titles. So when this chat's over, I will show you the book that I'm currently reading, and then I will do a drawing that will let the universe choose my next book. But let's get to the chat about the most recent book that I finished, and that is SPQR, A History of Ancient Rome, by Mary Beard. This was published in 2015, and I had this on my reading radar last year, but just because of my must-read list that I had and other things that I ended up reading, I didn't get to it. So I definitely wanted to put it on this year's must-read list, and so I'm just now getting it read. And wow, it was really, it was really good. It just covers quite a lot of information. It really covers 1,000 years worth of Roman history, which is not by far not all the Roman history there is, but it stops at 212, the year 212 AD. It starts with the mythological founding of Rome in what's generally dated to be around 753 BCE, with the mythological king Romulus. With the myth Romulus Remus, there were orphan brothers who were raised by a wolf. But that's sort of back in the mythological past. That from the founding of Rome as this tiny collection of villages all the way to the beginning of the Republic lasts several hundred years. That's typically given to be the Republic is typically dated to have begun around 509 BCE. And how that happened was, if you've ever heard the story of the rape of Lucretia, so Lucretia was a nobleman's wife, I think the story goes, and this is just from memory, but there was the son of a king whose name was Tarquinius, I think, and he wound up was hanging out with some friends, including Lucretia's husband, and they start talking about who's got the best wife, and so they go to Lucretia's house. Her husband's bragging on her. She's sitting there at her spinning wheel, being a model wife. And Tarquinius kind of lusts after her, comes back later, and basically forces a rape on her. She then reports this, and the people get so outraged that there is a revolt, and the monarchy is overthrown. And monarchy then, throughout the rest of Roman history, has this sort of reputation as being this horrible thing. Even though, eventually they do get autocratic emperors, these were not viewed as the same thing as kings somehow socially. But the Republic starts, like I said, in around 509. It lasts for several hundred years. It's starting getting on shaky ground. I mean, dating this, Mary Beard brings up in this work, that dating is sometimes rather fuzzy, and sometimes it's not an abrupt event, it's more of a transition, and the Republic itself is already transitioning towards autocracy before Julius Caesar comes along, and it is basically an autocrat, but he is assassinated in the year 44, and then his successor Octavian takes the name eventually of Augustus, and he's technically, I guess, the first emperor, and then the Rome moves into its empire phase, where it's expanding and it has an autocracy rather than a republic. Then by the time we get to the year 212, this is the year that the Emperor Caracalla declared everybody in the Roman Empire to be Roman citizens. And previously in Rome, sort of the definition of sort of the framework was Roman versus not Roman. So who was a Roman citizen versus who was not a Roman citizen. So that changed over time. It started out being just the citizens of Rome itself. Then it got expanded to people, some of the peninsula, then eventually all of the Italian peninsula. And then, there were different rules. And then ultimately it was it was everyone that was, no matter where you were in the empire itself, which basically covered the entire Mediterranean world and beyond, were considered Roman citizens. But then once Roman citizenship was given to everyone, it lost its meaning as far as that social framework went. And then so the framework after that, it morphed into other things like wealthy versus not wealthy, powerful versus not powerful, and increasingly more the new religion of Christianity, Christian versus pagan. So Mary Beard makes a point in this work that Augustus, even though we think, there's some good emperors and bad emperors, and you hear this bandied about when you read Roman history, the good emperors versus the sort of the depraved bad emperors like Nero and Caligula. But basically the structure of Rome did not change, like the government didn't change. Yes, there were different autocrats at the head that had different personalities, but the Rome itself did not significantly change structurally until around 212. During this period. And so she makes the argument that, Augustus, the first really emperor, would have recognized Rome throughout the subsequent 14 emperors up until the year 212. But then after 212, he would have a hard time, recognizing it because because the empire changed so much following that. Had a different religion coming up, and just a different structure, which is different. It had the East and West eventually splits, and there's Constantinople versus, Rome. So anyway, she doesn't cover that part in the book. But just my thoughts on the book, so Mary Beard's a very engaging writer, I thought. She's a little bit witty. There's a little British witticism in there. One thing, though, is that to consider is that the graffiti and things that have been uncovered through archaeology sometimes show a vulgar side, of whatever bars and writing on bathroom walls and bars and wherever. And so she just lets that out. So she drops a few F-bombs and other kinds of profanity. So if you're sensitive to that and you don't want to see that, just be forewarned. She doesn't really mince words with what the graffiti says, but she's got a bit of a wit about her. I actually looked up her blog. She does a blog called A Dawn's Life, because Mary Beard is a Cambridge professor of classics, and she does this blog called A Dawn's Life for the Times Literary Supplement, in England, and so it's an she's got an entertaining blog, really kind of interesting blog. I'll put the link to her blog down below just so that you can have that as a reference if you'd like. So my other takeaways, other than I found it very engaging and readable, it was broken down into really manageable segments. This regal period, the Republic period, and then the Empire period, this 1,000 years in very readable chapters to me. It was my experience anyway. But one thing that she's really good about doing is she's really good about bringing the experience of women, the poor, and slaves into the narrative. So oftentimes, when you read a Roman history, what you're really reading is sort of the cream of the crop, because that's what survived for the most part in the majorly known writings. People like Cicero and Tacitus, Seneca. These writings, are what we get and color a lot of what our perception of Rome was. But of course, this is a very one-sided, privileged, wealthy view. And there was this other Rome completely through the eyes of women, slaves, which were enormous, a number of slaves, as well as just the poor in general, which of course was the 99% of the people. So that was really sort of fresh and interesting to me. She does make a point in the epilogue to the book. She talks about why read ancient history, and I thought she made a really good point here. And so I'm just going to read a paragraph that she wrote from this last epilogue, because to me it was so sort of enlightening about my own sort of reasons why I like reading ancient history. And she says, but I am more and more convinced that we have an enormous amount to learn, as much about ourselves as about the past, by engaging with history of the Romans, their poetry and prose, their controversies and arguments. Western culture has a very varied inheritance. Happily, we are not the heirs of the classical past alone. Nevertheless, since the Renaissance at least, many of our most fundamental assumptions about power, citizenship, responsibility, political violence, empire, luxury, and beauty have been formed and tested in dialogue with the Romans and their writing. So this fundamental assumptions that she mentions there, this is something that I appreciate reading history in general and also ancient history, and that is these fundamental assumptions that societies build. We have our own set of fundamental assumptions now that we operate under that people don't even really think about or question that much. They just take as a given, but they haven't necessarily always been the same. So a very illustrative aspect of this is in ancient Rome, which Mary Beard talks about in this work, is infanticide was a commonly practiced thing and not at all socially frowned upon. So an infant, a newborn, was not considered a person until people decided they were going to rear the infant. So that if they decided they were not going to rear that infant, they just left it out to die. And so that shocks us today because our background narrative, our fundamental assumption is that once a baby's born, it's a person. But their fundamental assumption, their background narrative was that it was not. So that's a kind of a telling thing. So that to me it's very enriching. Granted, that's a gruesome example, but just sort of enriching, life enriching to try to uncover what my own background narrative is, what my own fundamental assumptions are, and question that, because it might not have always been that way, and it might not even be the best way. There might be a better future way to come. People in the future will look at our background assumptions and our fundamental assumptions, our background narrative, and say, why did they ever think that? So to me, that's the enriching thing about reading history. So I'm going to stop with that. I really enjoyed reading, and I'm so glad I got this read on my 2017 reading list because it was well worth the time. So what I'm reading now, I'll show you the cover to it. I'm reading it electronically, so I need to call it up on my iPad that has the nice color graphic. Right now, I am reading At the Existentialist Cafe, Freedom, Being, and Apricot Cocktails by Sarah Bakewell. This tells the story of the Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, among several others, creating existentialism back in the middle of the 20th century. So it's been very good. I'm on chapter 2 right now, and so far I'm giving it a thumbs up for being very engaging and interesting. And Sarah Bakewell is just a great writer. I've read another one of her works a couple of years ago about the life of Montaigne, which was very, very interesting. But let's get to the drawing for my next work. These are the 12 works I have left on my 2017 must-read TBR. So let's let the randomness of the universe choose my next book. My next read is going to be The Paper Menagerie. Been looking forward to this one, so I'm glad it came up. I'm gonna get the cover for you so that you can see it. The Paper Menagerie and Other Stories. To get it here. Just take me a second to get to the cover. This is by Ken Liu, who is a science fiction writer. This is a collection of his science fiction and fantasy stories, short story collection. I chose this because I don't normally read short stories. I'm not good about reading short stories, and I wanted to get a short story collection on my list. Some of these stories have won some awards, so I'm really looking forward to diving into this. This will be what I read after at the Existentialist Cafe. So until next time, take care.